All right, next in our conversation is Kadee Wirick Smedley.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Kadee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Um, there I am as well. Well, first off, I'm loving those fun earrings. I'm a big fan of a fun earring.
Thank you.
So your essay, you talked a lot about harm and the harm perpetuated by the church, and I think that's something that conversations around trauma and harm are becoming a lot more sort of in the zeitgeist lately. So can you talk a little bit about where you see harm being perpetrated and where we can, quote, lay the blame?
Yeah, I am the spiritual care practitioner at a homeless shelter for youth. So kids age 16 to 24 who come to us because they don't have a place to live. And um, there's a lot in the social sciences that establishes that there's a disproportionate number of queer kids who end up homeless because they're not accepted by their families of origin, by their larger communities, or by their faith communities. And unfortunately, in my work, I see that not in statistics, but in human beings, in young people who are coming in who have experienced that rejection to the point that they're not safe in their own homes. So the question of affirmation to me, I hope it was never theoretical in my mind, but it's way past theoretical now. When I say the church is causing harm by perpetuating its stance that queer folks are sinning by being queer or being in queer relationships, I'm telling you, I see it in the eyes of the kids who come through our doors.
Yeah. In some ways, this is kind of the dark inverse of that so many people are become affirming through having close relationships with queer people, that also you can really see the need for an affirming stance when you see the devastation and the harm caused to queer people as well.
Yeah, and I hope that it would make folks who are more skeptical about it reconsider their positions, because I'd like to believe that folks who center the love of God and love of neighbor would at least have questions raised if love looks like kids on the street.
Right. Right. Yep. I think this also sort of brings up sort of a tension here in often when conversations about trauma come up, that, oh, someone's traumatic story was really compelling. The sort of flip side of that is that it can bring up a lot of that trauma for the person telling the story. And so how do you think we balance this sort of sharing our hurts without asking too much of us that have been hurt?
First of all, I think I would say nobody is owed the story of a queer person.
Mhm.
You earn that story. So I think it's incumbent upon folks to take advantage of the many public venues that allow them to hear from queer folks who they don't have to earn trust to hear it in a one-on-one situation, right? There's
Right.
plenty of books, some of them are on the shelf behind me, of queer folks in a variety of religious backgrounds that can share what their experience was, coming up believing that the only way they could be part of the people of God, whichever people of God we're talking about, was by marrying someone of the opposite sex.
Mhm.
I think yeah, I think we have to earn the trust, but also there's resources out there to get us who are more skeptical and who are for sure somewhere way far from affirming. There's resources that we can access to hear those stories without traumatizing and further re-traumatizing someone who's had the courage to share it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So sort of in this conversation, we've heard a lot of statistics about queer people having a higher rate of mental health conditions and mental illness. And, a sort of really negative interpretation of that we may hear is that is evidence that being queer is unhealthy. that's a really hard thing to hear. And how do you even start to engage with people who make that kind of interpretation? And how would you sort of push back?
I think first of all, I would say we have statistics about what the mental health well-being versus illness is for folks who have someone who's affirming in their life versus don't.
Huge. Yeah.
Religion, I mentioned this, I think, in the essay, religion is a very protective factor against things like suicidality, for example, until you put a queer person in a non-affirming religious or spiritual community, and then it actually accelerates the risks of suicidality. So the idea that it's just there's something inherently pathological about queerness, I think that makes non-affirming folks feel a little vindicated, but that's certainly ignoring the much larger context, which is that queer folks thrive in situations of affirmation and safety and hospitality, and that those of us who choose to continue perpetuating homophobia, transphobia, anti-queerness, we're killing souls. And so, yeah, that's going to show up in a bunch of horrible ways, including mental illness, including suicidality, including, the harms that we see queer folks expressing in a variety of ways.
Right. I think it's a real sort of misunderstanding of mental illness and mental health concerns as sort of innate or without origin, that you can possibly connect things here. Whereas as you're sharing with these statistics about the outcomes when you have affirming community members versus not, there are influences here. We can trace these patterns. And as soon as you just see someone as statically queer, statically, mentally ill or neurodivergent, then you're sort of missing how you can also engage them as part of your community,
Yeah, for sure. I think it's worthwhile for us to always consider what's a reasonable response for a human being to have to the environment in which they're in. What's
Absolutely.
the reasonable response of a queer person to a surrounding that's saying you're sinning, that you can't be, it's impossible to be queer and Christian. Of course, it's going to destroy someone. So I think it's incumbent upon us in the church, and why I was part of writing this book, to say, how do we appropriately, by the grace of God, through the power of the Spirit, how do we create surroundings that not just allow queer folks to be part of us, but promote the health and well-being of our queer siblings in faith?
Absolutely. So we're talking a lot about the harm and the trauma that the church has caused and where we can sort of move forward from this. I think in sort of adjacent conversations, we might talk about reparations or about how to make a full apology. Basically, what does the church need to do to come to the table here? What steps do they need to take in response to acknowledging the trauma they've caused?
I think the first step's education, and we kind of already touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to be honest about what we're asking. It's a couple of weeks ago, the Jewish Forward posted an article that was talking about this will seem tangential, but it's not, I promise. Post an article about an Orthodox Jewish man who committed suicide because he was in, and similarly to us, a community that doesn't believe it's possible to be observant and in a same-sex marriage or committed relationship. And the article was saying, okay, if you're not going to change your halacha, if you're not going to change your interpretations, you got to at least look this harm in the face. This person died because of these teachings. And I feel like that's the first step towards reparations is, we have a truth and reconciliation movement up here in Canada, not for queer folks, but for Indigenous folks, for harms perpetuated. The first part is telling the truth. And I think the second part is asking those who we've harmed what reparation looks like. I think it demands that we not just have our own sort of fluffy ideas of what affirmation is, but say, okay, what is actually necessary for the church to be a place for queer folks to thrive? We're not there yet, and we need the prophetic voices of queer folks to light the way in that.
Right, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your perspective. I think this was really, really helpful for a lot of us. Thank you so much, Kadee.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much.